are often pragmatic to the point of being sadistic. That is, we treat one another like bitter enemies sometimes in order to protect and preserve and even accumulate money. In presenting this parable, Jesus is asking us to make a hard choice. In the translation that we read this morning, he concludes his teaching by commenting that no slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. But more popularly, this is one of those places where the King James Version has kind of disseminated out into the culture in ways that we know the King James Version of this better than we know these more clear translations. And in the King James, that the ending of that whole verse reads, you cannot serve two masters, you cannot serve God and mammon. A lot of people say, well, what's mammon? Mammon is a deity that is associated with wealth and money. So the choice that Jesus is presenting here has an urgency to it that we seldom acknowledge or recognize as contemporary readers of Scriptures, in the present time. Not only is Jesus talking about money as a deity to whom we are all too readily submit our lives and sacrifice even our most cherished relationships, but he's doing so at a time when the people who were listening to him truly believed, and in many cases even hoped, that the judgment day was imminent, that it was coming tomorrow at lunchtime. Many of the people listening to Jesus that day were so poor and so distressed by unjust treatment at the hands of the wealthy that they prayed longingly for God to intervene in such a way that their oppressors would be judged for their callousness, for the ways that they valued money over human life, over human dignity. They prayed for this to happen even if it meant the end of the world. This was their hope. But this is not just an allusion to final judgment that Jesus is presenting. There is good news here. Even if Jesus is presenting that good news with a bit of sarcastic humor. And I had to read this several times, and it just seems to me that that's what Jesus is doing here. He's being funny, but he's also being a little sarcastic. Essentially, the good news here is that God will set things right and will provide in abundance for those who have been treated unfairly by the prejudices and short-sightedness of those who have chosen wealth over the law of love that is written on our hearts. But here's the problem. In the course of a lifetime, it's most likely that each of us here has been, or at least will be, on both sides of God's judgment where the worship of wealth is concerned. That's because even though we do have the law of God's love written on our hearts, we have also been raised with the notion that wealth somehow connotes virtue. That if we acquire and maintain a certain, albeit ever-receding level of financial well-being, it's because we are good people who deserve it. The unfortunate implication of that belief is that anyone lacking adequate financial resources is in such a state because of some character flaw or some lack of worth as a human being. And I don't think that's what Jesus was trying to say. Here, Jesus is telling us that God doesn't see people that way. God doesn't judge your value based on the amount of money you have. In fact, he draws a very uncomfortable line in the sand with this parable, and his comments about it, claiming that the wisdom that makes one successful by the world's standard will do us no good once the calamities that precede the day of the Lord begin. When it all comes down, no amount of money is going to help you. In the end, Jesus is telling us what really matters, what will really matter, is the quality of your relationships. Essentially, what he says is, if you are in circumstances of privilege that have been gained dishonestly, the best way to redeem the situation is to use that wealth, and this is where the sarcastic humor comes in. The best understand that the availability of financial resources affords us choices and options that we wouldn't have in a condition of poverty. I know that. I've also observed how money motivates people in ways that lend painful credibility to the scriptural claim that the love of money is the root of all evil. For all intents and purposes, in society as it's been organized by humanity and human wisdom, money is a god that we have made with our own hands. And Jesus is reminding us here that the economy of God's kingdom is far more just than anything that we can imagine or invent, because we're just too wrapped up in fear and anxiety. Our wisdom is informed by fear and anxiety and this belief of lack. As individual people of faith, we have to work out often with some fear and trembling the ways that we balance our personal management of material resources with the teachings of our faith. Teachings that remind us over and over again to cultivate generosity of spirit and compassion for those who are alone and grieving and suffering. Where our individual spirituality is concerned, I would suggest that what Jesus is telling us here is that if we use our own material resources in service of the law of love, then we will find our way to the just kingdom of God. However, if we forget that we as children of God were made to love one another, and we continue to place a higher value on the acquisition of wealth than on our relationships with friends and family, then we will forget our way back home. Find our way there. But there's also some wisdom in this parable as it relates to the life of the congregation. And that is that when we find ourselves in situations where we're constantly talking about and worrying about money, we need to ask ourselves if we're being faithful managers of the resources that have been entrusted to us. We need to ask ourselves what percentage of our collective resources is committed to serving those who are alone and grieving and suffering, and what percentage is committed to staving out anxieties related to our future. We need to do that assessment in our own hearts. Remember, we serve a Lord who taught us not to worry about tomorrow, and who provided enough food to feed thousands from a basket full of bread and fish. In the economy of God's kingdom, much can be done. Love of money is the root of all evil, then anxiety about the future drives that love of money. So, which God will you serve? The one who enslaves you with unresolvable fear? Or the one who provides even for the least creatures of all creation, even the sparrows and the lilies of the field? When it's all said and done, will you be comforted by the presence of loved ones? Or will your closest companions